It all began with a 13-year-old Muslim boy who started visiting a local church every afternoon. He would enter quietly, spend only about 5 minutes inside, and then leave without interacting with anyone. At first, it seemed innocent enough, perhaps a child's curiosity about a place of worship different from his own. The local pastor initially assumed the boy might be interested in learning about Christianity, or simply fascinated by the church's architecture. But soon, the boy's repeated visits raised questions. He wasn't attending Mass or joining any of the lessons. Instead, he would quietly slip away to a secluded corner where one of the nuns spent her afternoons. This young nun, barely 19, was new to the church. Her gentle demeanor and striking appearance had already made her a familiar face among the parish children. Many of them gathered around her for stories and lessons, enjoying her kindness and warmth. However, the young Muslim boy's behavior was different. While other children sought her guidance openly, he approached her in hushed tones, sat with her briefly, and then left. It was a pattern that repeated every day, becoming a routine that the other church staff began to notice. The pastor grew increasingly suspicious. Who was this boy, and why did he keep visiting the nun in secret? As he observed their interactions from a distance, he noticed their conversations were brief but intense. The boy never stayed long, never lingered after their meetings. Whatever drew him back each day seemed important enough to risk scrutiny. What seemed at first to be a harmless interaction would soon uncover a story far more complex and far more controversial than anyone could have imagined. In a quiet village in France, a local church stood at the center of daily life. The head pastor, a man deeply committed to his faith, had always viewed his church as a stronghold of Christian tradition. Having grown up with a strict religious upbringing, he harbored a deep-seated distrust of Muslims. Although he had never interacted with one personally, he believed they represented a threat to the sanctity of his community's faith. The arrival of a 19-year-old nun had recently brought a new energy to the church. She was young, cheerful, and her approachable manner quickly won over the parish children who attended Bible lessons after school. She had only been at the church for a few weeks when the pastor first noticed something unusual. After her lessons, she would often retreat to the garden, where a boy, a quiet 13-year-old Muslim, would join her. At first, the pastor assumed the boy was a curious child, perhaps intrigued by the church's teachings. But soon he noticed a pattern. Every afternoon, the same boy appeared. He would approach the young nun, greet her politely, and sit down to talk. Their interactions were brief, lasting only minutes, and then the boy would leave. It was this repetition that began to raise the pastor's suspicions. He wondered why the boy, a Muslim no less, kept returning and why the nun never mentioned these visits. One evening, the pastor decided to watch more closely. Standing unnoticed, he saw the boy greet the nun not with hello or good evening, but with a soft assalamu alaikum. That Arabic greeting, common among Muslims, confirmed what the pastor had suspected but could hardly believe. A Muslim boy coming to his church, speaking with one of his nuns, was an unthinkable scenario for him. The discovery left him shaken. This went beyond mere curiosity. It felt like an invasion, a threat to the church's sanctity. This newfound awareness changed everything. The pastor's thoughts began to race. Was the boy trying to influence the nun? Could he be attempting to undermine her faith? These questions weighed heavily on the pastor, who now felt compelled to act. He resolved to confront the situation directly, determined to uncover the truth about these mysterious visits. The pastor's suspicions about the Muslim boy's repeated visits continued to grow. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, and after witnessing their brief but frequent meetings, he knew he had to find answers. His initial thought was that it might simply be a misunderstanding. Perhaps the boy was just curious about Christianity or the church itself. Yet, day after day, the boy returned. He would appear in the late afternoon, speak quietly with the young nun in the garden for a few minutes, and leave without participating in any other church activities. The situation seemed too deliberate, too secretive. Determined to uncover the truth, the pastor started asking questions. He approached the other children who regularly attended the church's lessons and casually inquired about the boy. Many of them confirmed that he came to the church at the same time every day, but they couldn't offer much insight into what he and the nun discussed. Some of the children admitted they found the nun's behavior puzzling. While she maintained strict discipline with them, she seemed unusually kind and gentle toward the Muslim boy. This only deepened the pastor's unease. One afternoon, the pastor decided to follow the boy after he left the church. From a distance, he watched as the boy walked through the narrow village streets, eventually stopping at a small, modest house. The pastor noted that the house belonged to a Muslim family, confirming his earlier suspicions about the boy's faith. The boy then continued on to a local market, where he polished shoes for a living. His routine was simple and unremarkable, yet the pastor felt no closer to understanding why he was visiting the church every day. The pastor began to piece together what little he knew. Here was a young Muslim boy leading an ordinary life, yet visiting the church regularly to speak with one specific nun. He wasn't attending mass or religious classes, and he showed no sign of trying to convert to Christianity. The nun's warm reception of him, so unlike her strict demeanor with other children, troubled the pastor. It became clear that the only way to get to the bottom of this was to confront the nun herself and demand an explanation for her actions. The pastor could no longer ignore the situation. The daily visits, the boy's mysterious purpose, and the nun's behavior all pointed to something that needed clarity. So one afternoon, as the boy arrived to meet the nun, the pastor followed closely and decided to intervene. He stepped into the garden where the boy and the nun were quietly sitting, their heads bowed in conversation. "Why is this boy here every day?" the pastor asked, his voice stern and his expression firm. The nun, taken aback, glanced at the boy before turning her attention to the pastor. "He comes here because he wants to learn about Christianity," she said after a pause. "He's curious about our faith and seeks understanding. I've been teaching him about our beliefs and answering his questions." The boy, perhaps sensing the tension, nodded. "I'm trying to understand the truth," he said softly. "I come here to listen, to learn." The pastor's initial anger softened somewhat. After all, converting others to Christianity was something he had spent his life trying to do. If this Muslim boy was genuinely interested, then the nun's efforts could be seen as noble. "You've been teaching him Christianity?" he asked again, his voice slightly less severe. "Yes," the nun replied. "He comes to me in secret because he's afraid of what others might think. But his questions are sincere, and I feel it's my duty to help him find the answers he's looking for." At first, the pastor felt a sense of relief. This wasn't what he had feared, a scandal or something improper. Instead, it appeared to be an opportunity to share their faith with someone from a different background. "Very well," he said. "But keep in mind that this church is a place of worship and respect. If this boy truly seeks truth, let it be found here." What the pastor didn't realize was that this interaction was just the beginning. The conversations that the boy and the nun shared were not solely about Christianity, and the truth they sought might not align with what he expected. While the pastor thought the situation was under control, the nun and the boy were continuing a dialogue that was about to take an unexpected turn. Weeks passed, and the pastor assumed the matter had resolved itself. He stopped keeping a close eye on the nun's meetings with the boy. As far as he was concerned, the situation was now harmless. Just a young nun answering the questions of a curious boy. Life at the church seemed to settle back into its familiar routine. But then, one evening, the pastor arrived at the church unexpectedly. The sun was setting, and he expected to find the usual quiet, perhaps a few parishioners in silent prayer, or the nun preparing for the next day's lessons. Instead, as he stepped through the heavy wooden doors, he froze. A sound echoed through the sanctuary that he could not believe. It was the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, and it was being recited loud and clear. The voice was not that of the Muslim boy. It was the nun. She stood at the front of the church, speaking with conviction and confidence. Gathered around her were a few children who listened intently. As she finished the declaration, she began to speak about what she had learned and what she now believed to be true. The pastor's heart raced. His face turned red with anger and shock. He burst into the room and shouted, "What are you doing?" The nun turned to face him calmly. "I have embraced Islam," she said, her voice steady, "and I intend to guide others to the truth I have found." The room fell silent. The children looked on, confused but captivated. The pastor, his fury barely contained, struggled to understand what had just happened. This was no longer just a curious boy asking questions. This was something far greater, something that could shake the very foundation of the church. The pastor stood frozen, his mind reeling as the reality of the situation sank in. The nun he had trusted, the nun who had only recently joined their church, was now openly declaring her conversion to Islam. Worse yet, she was reciting the Islamic declaration of faith within the walls of his sanctuary and teaching it to the children entrusted to her care. His face turned pale, then bright red with fury. He clenched his fists and took a step closer to her, his voice trembling with anger. "How dare you?" he shouted. "You betrayed your vows, your church, and everything we stand for. What has possessed you to do this?" The nun stood her ground, her expression calm but determined. "I have found the truth," she replied simply. "I have read, I have questioned, and I have learned. I believe now with all my heart that Islam is the path I must follow." Her words only fueled the pastor's rage. "You dare speak of truth while leading children astray. You're corrupting their minds, their faith." He pointed at the children who stood silently watching the confrontation. "What do you think will happen if this continues? You think this is acceptable?" But the nun refused to back down. "I cannot hide what I believe," she said. "I cannot ignore what I now know to be right. These children deserve to hear the truth, and I will not stop speaking it." The pastor's voice grew louder. "Do you understand what you're saying? You've turned your back on your entire community. This will not go unpunished. You will face the consequences of your betrayal." Still, the nun remained firm. "Do what you must," she replied, her voice steady. "But I cannot deny what I now hold to be true." The children remained silent, their wide eyes darting between the pastor and the nun. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on everyone in the room. The pastor's frustration reached a boiling point as he turned to the other church officials who had gathered in the doorway. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly. "She must be removed. We cannot allow this heresy to continue in our church." But despite his outrage, the nun's calm defiance did not waver. Her steadfastness only deepened the conflict, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation that would change everything. Tensions within the church were at a breaking point. After the pastor's declaration that the nun must be removed, a group of church elders and local villagers gathered to witness her punishment. They viewed her actions as not only a betrayal, but also a dangerous precedent. If one nun could abandon her faith, others might follow. The pastor resolved that her punishment must serve as a stark warning. The plan was to symbolically mark her as an example. She was to be tied near the altar, where she would stand as a grim reminder to anyone tempted to stray. As the ceremony began, the church was eerily quiet. The villagers, watching from a distance, were subdued but curious. Everyone's attention was fixed on the scene inside the sanctuary. The air felt heavy, filled with tension and unease. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled. At first it was subtle, just a faint vibration. But within moments the entire church began to shake. The walls groaned, the wooden beams creaked, and the statues lining the walls toppled over, crashing to the ground. The congregation scattered in fear, running out of the building as the tremors grew stronger. Shouts of panic filled the air as people tried to make sense of what was happening. Amid the chaos, the nun stood resolute, calmly reciting the Shahada. Though the statues fell and the walls cracked, she remained unharmed. Her voice carried above the noise, a steady and unbroken declaration of faith. When the shaking finally subsided, the church was left damaged, its statues shattered, and its congregation in disarray. Those who witnessed the event could only whisper in awe. Some saw it as a divine message, others as an ominous warning. Either way, it was a moment that changed everything. As the dust settled on the scene and the chaos quieted, the villagers began to piece together what had led to this extraordinary turn of events. The boy, the key figure in the drama, now stood out as someone they barely knew, yet he had sparked a series of actions that had shaken the church's foundation, literally and figuratively. This boy wasn't just any ordinary visitor. Though young, he was deeply committed to his Muslim faith. It all began when, out of sheer curiosity, he wandered into the church one day. He had heard stories about what went on inside, about the statues and sermons, and he wanted to see it for himself. The boy didn't expect anything more than a glimpse of a different world. But as he lingered near the edge of the sanctuary, he overheard something that stirred something deep inside him. The nun, in a soft voice, was explaining a passage that described Jesus, peace be upon him, as the Son of God, an idea the boy knew contradicted what he had learned about monotheism. Compelled to respond, he recited Surah Ikhlas, the Quranic chapter affirming the oneness of God. His voice was quiet but firm. The nun, intrigued by his conviction, turned to him and asked what he had said. It was the start of an unexpected dialogue. The boy didn't come back to the church intending to argue or preach, but the nun's questions and his responses turned into an ongoing discussion. Each evening they met for a short time, exchanging ideas. She shared what she had learned about Christianity. He shared the teachings of Islam. What began as a simple exchange soon grew into a challenge. The nun proposed that they continue for a month. She would teach him about her faith, and he would share what he knew of his own. If her beliefs held more truth, the boy would consider Christianity. But if the boy's words resonated more, she agreed to explore Islam further. This arrangement became the reason for his daily visits. What the villagers and pastor had thought was a casual meeting turned out to be a profound mutual exploration of faith. Over time, their discussions would take a life-changing turn that no one in the village could have anticipated. In the following days, the boy returned to the church armed with more knowledge. He shared verses from the Quran and stories from the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The nun listened intently, her curiosity growing with every conversation. She had always been devout, but she had also been someone who asked questions, sought clarity, and wanted to truly understand the path she was on. The boy, despite his youth, spoke with a sincerity and calm that left a deep impression. He explained the simple beauty of Islam's teachings, its clear monotheism, its emphasis on justice, and the concept of worshiping God directly without intermediaries. Each time she asked him about a particular belief or practice, he would respond thoughtfully, often reciting Quranic verses or mentioning sayings of the Prophet. The answers were straightforward and logical, and they began to resonate with her more and more. As days turned into weeks, the nun found herself pondering the ideas the boy had shared. What started as a series of intellectual discussions began to touch her heart. She started reading the material he brought her and reflecting on the questions she had long kept hidden. Why did she believe what she believed? Were her convictions based on true understanding, or had they simply been passed down to her without question? Gradually, she felt a shift within herself. The faith she had grown up with no longer answered the questions she was facing. In contrast, the boy's explanations, his descriptions of God's oneness, the simplicity of Islam's teachings, and the equality it preached, seemed to provide clarity where before there had been confusion. It was as though the fog she had lived in was lifting, and what she saw on the horizon was not what she expected. The days following the nun's conversion were tense and filled with uncertainty. Word spread quickly throughout the village, and soon everyone knew what had transpired. The once quiet, predictable church now stood at the center of heated discussions. The villagers, some astonished, others confused, began to question what had led one of their own nuns to make such a bold and unexpected decision. Initially, the church's leadership tried to downplay the situation. The pastor addressed the congregation, urging them to hold fast to their faith and dismiss the events as the actions of a confused individual. But the nun's transformation was not something they could simply brush aside. Her conviction was evident. She spoke openly to those who approached her, explaining that her decision to embrace Islam had not been made on a whim. It was a choice born out of careful consideration, study, and a sincere quest for truth. As more people heard her story, they began to reflect on their own beliefs. Some were drawn to her courage and the clarity of her explanations. Villagers who had never before questioned their faith found themselves reconsidering long-held assumptions. Over time, a growing number of them sought out the Muslim boy who had first engaged her in conversation. His youth and simplicity belied the depth of his knowledge. He became a quiet but significant figure in the village, answering questions and providing insight. The church, once a place of steadfast tradition, now faced dwindling attendance. Many of the villagers no longer felt the same attachment to it, with more and more people finding resonance in the Islamic teachings shared by the boy and the nun. The church's role in the community diminished. The pastor, though steadfast in his own beliefs, could no longer maintain the congregation's trust and loyalty. Eventually, the decision was made to close the church permanently. What had once been the village's spiritual hub now stood empty. For the remaining Christians, it was a bittersweet end to an era. For the new Muslim community, it marked the beginning of something new. In a quiet corner of the village, the Muslim boy's unassuming quest for truth had sparked a profound transformation that reshaped the community's identity, leaving a legacy of dialogue and understanding.